Morning, good afternoon, and good evening, as we're fond of saying to our audience of participants around the globe. Many of you have been with us quite a few times for these Interfor international briefings, and those of you who have been with us before will notice that this one looks quite different for two important reasons. Number one, Interfor CEO Don Aviv typically starts things off, welcomes us, sets the table for these conversations, but due to the government shutdown, which has impacted the FAA, Don's flight out of LaGuardia was badly delayed and he is still in the air. So we wish Don well, and hopefully he will be arriving to Washington, D.C. quite soon. The other reason this looks quite different is that we're normally together virtually, but I am here in Washington, D.C. at the offices of K&L Gates being hosted by Guillermo Christensen and K&L Gates. And we're very excited to be here for this very different discussion, and we're excited to get started. So as I mentioned, I have Guillermo Christensen with me of K&L Gates and Pete Marta of Goodwin Procter. Just Goodwin, right? Yes, excuse me. So we will be getting started and telling you about a very interesting topic we have today, which is from CIA to law firm, as we described it. So we think this is going to be a really fascinating discussion, full of insights on how to use different skills from the world of intelligence, practical ideas about cybersecurity, and maybe a little bit about international affairs. We'll see what we can get into today. But let me start by doing a bit of an introduction. I'm going to start with our host here, Guillermo Christensen. Good morning, Guillermo.
Good morning.
Guillermo Christensen is a partner in the national security practice of K&L Gates, a global law firm. He counsels clients on national security and technology, including AI, cybersecurity, CFIUS, export controls, and complex technology matters. Prior to becoming a lawyer, Guillermo served in multiple international assignments as a CIA intelligence officer. From 2001 to 2002, he was a CIA fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City, and he later served in a diplomatic assignment as the Science and Technology Advisor in Paris at the U.S. mission of the OECD. Guillermo is also an adjunct professor of artificial intelligence at Georgetown University's Law School, and he's an instructor at the FBI CISO Academy. Good morning once again, Guillermo.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for hosting us today.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
And I'm also joined by Pete Marta. Good morning to you, Pete.
Good morning to you.
Pete is a partner at Goodwin's Complex Litigation and Dispute Resolution Group and Data Privacy and Cybersecurity Practice. He advises global organizations at the C-suite level and board level as well on all aspects of responding to complex cybersecurity incidents, which are quite numerous these days, as I've understood, as well as on cyber and data risk management and governance, proactive cyber incident readiness, insider threats, regulatory strategy, and government and internal investigations. Leveraging decades of experience in government and the private sector, Pete helps clients navigate the rapidly evolving cybersecurity threat landscape. He responds to a broad range of crises, finds practical solutions to complex problems, and Pete has also served as an operations officer in the intelligence community. So let's start with some basic things here with you guys. I always like to start off talks about intelligence by helping people understand that spies are quite different from what we see in Hollywood TV shows and movies. They're all great fun, but I think that if we're going to learn about what it means to be an intelligence officer, we should take things from that world of Hollywood and make it a little bit more real. So a lot of people have certain impressions from these Hollywood TV shows and movies and books on who spies are and what they do. So I'm hoping that you could talk a little bit more about the realities of being an intelligence officer, how they're different from what we see in Hollywood. And if you could also speak to whatever extent is, of course, appropriate about the work you did at the CIA, I think that would be really helpful. And I'm going to start off with our host today, Guillermo, and kick that over to you.
So the first thing that should be obvious is neither of us could ever star in any movie about this. And then the other thing I would also say is that and I love, Jeremy is the author of a book called Selling Like a Spy, which I highly recommend to anyone who wants to learn the art of business development. But, you know, spies, say intelligence officers, that's really the term we use. Spies are the people who we would have working for us. In our old business, we hated to talk about ourselves. Our whole mission was to get you to talk to us about what you do, right? And that's one of the, I think, one of the learnings that you share. But I do think it's in many ways, it was one of the most interesting types of work I've ever done. The variety of challenges, the dimensions of the problems, the level of performance that you had to be at was intense. I often recommend to people who ask me, now, is there a movie I should watch, a TV show, a book? And I say, there's one book above all that I would recommend you read, and that's $1 Billion Spy. Which the reason why it's so critical in my mind is it discusses the meticulousness of the planning and the mindset that you have to engage in when your job is to build relationships with people whose identity and the fact that they are in a relationship with you, a covert relationship, is the reason they stay alive or they don't go to jail. And when you have their lives in your hands, the responsibility you feel for that is almost in, I would imagine doctors and, EMT technicians would share that, but it is, it's a very, very important and I think deeply felt obligation that you carry, and you carry for the rest of your life. There are people that I worked with who I can never talk about, and if I saw them in the airport, I'd have to go the other way, and I'd hope that they wouldn't do the same. But that's what this is about. And so when I think of what Pete and I do now working with clients, there's a lot of that I think that flows through that because I care very deeply about my clients because I'm a lawyer now, but also because this is what I was trained and basically brought up to do from the moment that I graduated from college. That's the world that I was thrown into right at the pivotal moment of the end of the Cold War, which now seems, about 2,000 years ago. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Guillermo. Pete, would love your thoughts as well.
Yeah, a few thoughts on how the reality of being an intelligence officer differs from the movies or television. One, I would say, I'm curious for Guillermo's thoughts. I think women make the best intelligence officers for a variety of reasons. And I'm not sure that that's captured, in Hollywood films for some obvious reasons, patience, the ability to convey empathy. A lot of the traits that I think we're going to be talking about today that an intelligence officer needs to have. I'm generalizing here, but I think women have probably more frequently and more deeply. So that's one area. The other area that was a surprise to me was the importance of writing, actually.
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen James Bond write up a cable, but it became very clear at the farm in training that was an important skill set, and that was surprising to me. One of the concepts that they really instilled in us was, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen.
Right.
Meaning you could have had the world's greatest ops meeting last night, huge operational milestones, a ton of FI that's going to hit the foreign intelligence that's going to hit the presidential daily briefing. If you don't write it down, and you don't write it down clearly, it's might as well not have happened. So, and then finally, I don't think I saw a case officer in a Tom Ford suit or any Aston Martins in the.
We'll save that for law firm partners, right?
Well, I will say I was once told we were pursuing some very hard targets, trying to be imaginative, and I said, "Well, like, what can I do? I mean, what if this guy likes fast cars?" And the chief of this particular unit was like, "I will authorize you a QPV, a quasi personal vehicle, if that's what you need." And I love cars, so I was like, "Okay, now I gotta find somebody in this organization that likes cars so I can make this work." Never happened, but I totally agree on women as case officers, and the agency took a long time to figure that out, and I think now they clearly have, and absolutely it is, and it works in all cultures.
Yeah. It really does.
The old kind of BS lines about, well, in the Middle East, no, totally the opposite.
Some of the most effective.
Yeah,
for sure.
And on your point about notes, it is so vital. And the thing is, when you're taking notes on these things, you're not doing it while you're meeting with the person, because you're trying to look like you're not meeting with the person. You might be in a car or something like that. And so you learn the art of, you leave a meeting and you write everything down in your short-term memory immediately. And that's been incredibly helpful in many other ways, but yeah, totally agree.
We could probably just continue with this, and I have other questions to ask you, but just a couple of quick builds there, because there's just too much there. On female case officers, it just brings to mind how good the CIA is at questions of diversity and using kind of a best athlete approach, whether it's in the Middle East and leveraging, a woman to go after a certain target, because they could be in a full dress cover, right? And they won't draw the attention and scrutiny of security services. So I've heard about that approach, and I talk about in the book and to audiences about diversity and how the CIA leverages that. And also, I think that's a fascinating point also on note-taking and doing kind of a brain dump after a meeting. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not only about the intelligence that you're gathering, it's about the state of the agent too. Do they have bags under their eyes? Do they feel stressed? And this is all important, and people should keep that in mind in the business world as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you're going to be taking notes, because the other reason you take the notes is at some point, and it's usually a couple of years, you're going to do a handover to someone who will maybe meet that, we call them assets, for the first time when they meet them for the first time. So they need to read this file and try to be able to almost put themselves in your shoes with all of these things. So you're absolutely writing down atmospherics, anything that would indicate the state of mind of the asset, but also things around the environment. Was there anything odd? Because there are no coincidences. At least we should never act like there can be coincidence. So if you see something one time, you sure as heck want that in there, because somebody may see it again in 2 years, especially in what I'll call the denied areas, like in the Soviet Union, Russia. Every single blade of grass that was out of sorts, and that's the $1 billion spy, they make that point. You had to account for it, because that could be the one clue you have that they have surveillance on you. And, it's not like in the movies when they have surveillance and you do all these, high-speed runs to get rid of it. No, there's surveillance, you walk away. Right. Because that's it. You're not putting anybody's life on line. So.
It's also important to write down and memorialize how the developmental or the asset learn the information that they're giving you, if it's FI, if it's foreign intelligence, and why someone may have provided it to them, and what was the motivation. You're trying to understand their access, and you're always trying to evaluate and reevaluate their level of access.
Fascinating. Absolutely. Before I get into the next question, I want to encourage the audience to ask their questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions in there. Have you ever had a question you wanted to ask a spy? Now is the time. So please put that in the Q&A, and we'll be getting to your questions in a little while, but I'm going to continue with mine. So the title of this webinar is From CIA to Law Firm. So let's talk a little bit about that journey for a moment. Pete, you were actually in the legal field prior to being in the CIA, so I want to start with you. I think the audience would really benefit from hearing a little bit more about your career path. So Pete, why don't you start with that?
Happy to. Yeah, I don't know if it would be beneficial or confusing. It was the opposite of a straight path, and wouldn't encourage anyone to try to emulate it. Yeah, so I was a lawyer first. My path was law school, law firm, the agency, then moving back into the private sector as an in-house attorney, and then back to a law firm after 15 years. 9/11 happened. I know you were already in. It happened my second day of my second year in law school.
Wow.
And I knew I wanted to serve. I didn't know how. I also knew that I had borrowed a small fortune to attend law school, so I wanted to see that through, and did. I was also older. I was in my late 20s by the time I got out of law school, and so for me, serving probably wasn't going to be a Navy SEAL.
Yeah.
But I joined another big law firm out of law school. But I think I knew I had other plans, and so started the application process fairly quickly. Moved into the agency, served in a variety of ways that we can talk about, and then eventually made the very, very difficult decision to leave.
Yeah.
and then go back, sort of re-enter the practice of law.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I know I've heard from you guys and from so many former case officers, they come from all walks of life. I know we've talked about opera singers, policemen, athletes, all sorts of things. And that's, again, an example of the diversity within the agency and public service. So I think it's a huge strength. Could you talk a little bit more to whatever extent is appropriate about what you were doing at the agency?
Yes, happy to. So case officers are typically generalists. You're trained to be able to go after a variety of targets. A lot of us tend to specialize either in a particular area of the world or a topic like CI, counterintelligence. I spent a lot of time on topics related to the greater Middle East and South Asia, we'll say. I was also a NOC officer, non-official cover officer for most of my time there, which meant my cover was not that of a diplomat working at,
which is typical, right?
Which is very, very typical, or foreign office, you know, in other countries. It was a businessman, and that cover, at least theoretically, allows an officer to get closer to a hard target who may be, absolutely unwilling to even have a conversation with an official from the U.S. government.
Right.
So, an Iranian nuclear scientist might be an example of that.
But it also is more dangerous too, because you don't have that kind of diplomatic community. So, kudos to you for operating in that way. Guillermo, can you tell us a little bit about your career path and what you were doing at the agency?
Yeah, I was finishing my master's degree at Georgetown and had no desire whatsoever to go to law school. In fact, I was already tired of school. I was not a big fan of school in general. And I did an internship with the State Department in Cape Town. I lived in South Africa.
Great.
And this was in 89, 90 when Mandela's talks were underway. And some of the people there came to me and said, "You should come work for us." And I said, "Who is us?" I thought they were Treasury Department. So that started that. So ended up there, did almost 16 years, I think, total of time at the agency, with a lot of what I'll call out-of-body experiences. So I had a very non-traditional kind of career path at CIA, because I was on the operations side. I went through all of that training in the beginning, spent a lot of time overseas. Some of it that's public was in the Balkans during the wars there, which was, that was our war. It was a good war for kind of feeling good about what you were doing. Got involved with supporting peace negotiations with the State Department. That pulled me into more policy things. I had the good fortune that Secretary Albright had been one of my professors at Georgetown. So it brought me into, it was just a very unusual thing. And then 2001, Director Tenet basically did a directed assignment, frankly, for me to go to New York to be at the Council on Foreign Relations, because they wanted somebody there who'd been a field person to work on that. And I arrived 3 weeks before 9/11.
Wow.
So that year was an unusual year. I would go to see NYPD stations every couple of weeks to brief them on how to assess a human asset, if there had been any Al-Qaeda assets in New York. And then at the end of that, I was asked to go over to the Bureau, and I spent a year working for Director Mueller and his staff with a small team of CIA people, helping to build what's now the FBI's intelligence program, which was, a tough duty, because at that time, it was intense. And that's when I started going to law school at night. Because, I had at least 4 hours of extra sleep that I needed to burn out. So, but that was partially because when I had spent that year at CFR, I'd already been thinking I wanted to go and do something in the private sector and maybe come back. I wasn't sure. And law school, I had a dinner with, I think it was with Jim Woolsey, who was back in practicing law. And he said, "Look, what you do is troubleshooting and trying to fix problems. And that's not an MBA thing. That's a JD thing." So I went and did law school at night. So
it makes sense. Makes sense. Well, now that
I'm still wondering about it.
I think it's worked out okay.
I'll give you a verdict. Yeah.
Well, now that we know a little bit more about the realities of espionage, talking about this, and more about your career paths too. Let's talk a little bit about something that's been a big focus for me, regarding my book, Sell Like a Spy, which is using the spy skills to connect with agents and overcome obstacles, to use those in your career. We've already started that, of course, talking about leveraging diversity, talking about note-taking, but let's get into it a little bit more. Can you talk about some of the skills that have helped your work as lawyers? And I have a few ideas on it myself, but I would love to hear from you guys about it. I think we went with Pete as the first for the last time, so Guillermo, over to you first on this one.
Oh, absolutely, and I'm really interested to hear what Pete will say on this. But well, the first is the idea of elicitation, the way that you encourage people to share information with you is incredibly important in the intelligence world, and is equally important in the legal field. And I think what my training and what my experience, the edge it gave me over lawyers who have perhaps more traditional litigation or even prosecutors, is we're much more open-ended about it. When I conduct interviews, and I did a lot of FCPA work, I would spend time building rapport with the person we were interviewing, and we call them interviews in the legal world, right? And I remember a few times my colleagues saying, "Why don't we just dig into the substance?" And then later on, they would realize, "Oh, I get it. You were able to kind of have a relationship with this person who came into the room extremely nervous because they knew they'd done something wrong, and they were meeting with 3 lawyers in Kuala Lumpur from America." At that point, nobody's comfortable. So you have to ease into it. And then I would sometimes kind of pull some of my colleagues aside and give them some tips, especially the prosecutors who would be in there trying to basically prosecute, as opposed to, it's the client, so we're not here to prosecute. So some of that would be important. The one thing I will just note, when I read Selling Like a Spy the first time, you stop the story at one level of the work, right? Because there's a point beyond which no one in any kind of commercial enterprise should go, which is the recruiting and manipulation of individuals.
Right.
And the funny thing is, that's what we spend most of our time trying to figure out how to do well. And it's a subtle art. I have worked with, in fact, one of my first bosses was a legendary CIA officer, was the most unassuming person you could imagine. And yet, when we were in a room with a very, very difficult individual who was not recruited, and in fact, his ultimate goal was probably to try to kill us, and he was a terrorist, the way he came alive and managed that relationship, I was just sitting there. I was taking furious notes. This was in a place where we could take notes, but I was thinking to myself, wow, it's 2 people.
Yeah.
And a lot of what you end up learning to do is the acting and the way you want to be perceived. And that's to me, that's one of the most fascinating parts of the work. And it still is part of what I do. But it's one part of, you should write a second book where it's not selling like a spy or something like that, where you can touch on those issues.
All right, great idea. I'll touch base with my agent on it. Before I pass it over to you, Pete, I actually just want to take a moment to define elicitation and talk about it for just a second, because it comes up so much when I'm talking to lawyers who want to more subtly extract information, which is at the heart of elicitation. I describe it as a more strategic way to gather information. And I always tell people that when you meet somebody you want to learn from, if you start peppering them with questions, it can elicit a response that's the opposite of what you're going for. Defensiveness, cynicism, suspicion. So leveraging elicitation to get a response is really a great way to gather information. And you guys have been trained on that, as I've understood. There are some really cool exercises. I reference them in my book, and they're also based on human nature. So just very quickly, the tendency to correct is my favorite. So if I say, Pete, isn't your favorite color blue? You'll say, no, my favorite color isn't blue, it's red. Because people will almost always correct the record about anything about themselves. They will often respond to things in kind. Oh, isn't it a hot day today? I'm dying today. And they say, yeah, but it's no big deal. It's, it was really cold yesterday and I prefer the heat. They'll tell you something. So CIA case officers are trained and understand there are ways to get information from somebody without asking direct questions and tipping your hand, which I think is a very valuable skill for anybody, but certainly lawyers, right? So, Pete, I don't want to tee that up specifically to you, but because you can answer in any way, and I have a few bills for you guys on this. Not getting off so easy with just one quick answer, but Pete, any way you want to take that is great.
A couple of the things that Guillermo said, I'll react to. A lot of it is acting, and in fact, that's how we're trained at the farm. It's mostly role playing and talking to folks who are still in now. Actually, they've increasingly over time, the way you're interviewed for that job is a lot of it is role playing, which is very different than any other type of job interview. Also rapport building, right? I mean, that's maybe the most fundamental trait that you have to show signs that you have, or you're not going to get hired into that job. And then you get trained to improve over time. And in building truly building personal relationships. And, one way to do that, I think, is to find a way to be helpful to someone. And what that looks like in the intelligence world can vary widely. But as a law firm partner, I'd be curious for your thoughts. One way to do that might be to help a client find their next role. Maybe, at another client of yours, or help them hire with their hiring needs, or introduce them to a new potential customer. So helping grow their business, or speak to their son or daughter who may be interested in the field of law or the world's second oldest profession, right? Finding ways to be helpful and useful, I think, is really important. To get to the point where you can be helpful, though, I think requires another important skill set, right? Which is, again, rapport building, but also active listening and, assessing over time motivations and needs.
Yeah.
And then I think a last sort of area is, and we see this a lot in, when you're dealing with a cyber attack, is just the ability to convey confidence and competence in highly, highly stressful situations and persuade people to, follow your lead and your guidance.
Really fascinating. I want to stick with this for just a minute and come back to specifically rapport building, because obviously important in the legal space, but I think anybody who's with us today would agree that building rapport with people is important. And you referenced this earlier. You're sitting with a terrorist in a room. You're trying to win that person over. So let's stay with rapport building for just a little bit longer. I often talk about elements of rapport building like radical empathy, vulnerability, intellectual curiosity. I also love what you said about active listening. Some are better than others. You talked about that legendary case officer who was very low key. I bet he's a natural listener. Not all case officers are like that. In my book, Mark Polymeropoulos, who's got a big personality and loves to talk, he had to work at that. And he was our most recent guest on this series. So I just want to take it back to Guillermo, and then we'll get back to you, Pete, if there's anything else you want to build on there to talk about that rapport building and maybe any of the elements that I just referenced.
Yeah, I think active listening, which can be defined in many different ways, is one of the most critical pieces of that. And it is interesting because I think it's a little bit of a curse now that you know how that should be, because you can be speaking with people and you can already tell they're not listening to you.
Yeah.
Even if they're not doing anything else, just by the way that their face is moving, they're thinking about what they want to say and they've disengaged. And that's important sometimes when you're trying to engage someone and give you information, because you really need them to think carefully. And if they already have their answer in mind, it's not going to be the considered answer. Yeah. So you need to then, there's another aspect of that, which is to encourage people to be active listeners to you. And that sometimes takes easing back a little bit from the questions you're asking, how you're doing that, so you can really get them in the room with you.
That's really interesting.
Is really important. But the rapport, the interesting thing about rapport is, we don't, in our own lives, we're dealing with people that I would not necessarily want to be friends with. I mean, by definition. Some, yes,
Yeah.
some you have a
Yeah.
great deal of sympathy for. But you have to figure out a way to like something about them. And I know it sounds, with a terrorist, how can you know? If you don't, human beings are extremely perceptive.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to pretend that you like them and you can't do a good job, they're going to know. And then everything falls apart because the whole basis of trust is then corroded and it doesn't work. And that takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
It does take curiosity, I think. It takes understanding the other person and finding something. And it could be, they had a bad childhood. They have a child that's sick. I mean, there's so many touch points that two totally different people can have that bring commonality. And that's incredibly important. And if you have that, if you understand the value of that, it pays dividends in everything else. I mean, I've been on airplanes with someone who is, the typical, slamming your, and after a couple of conversations during an 8-hour flight, they would give me their seat.
Yes.
Right. But, that's better than leaving a plane feeling like the whole flight I was next to this, obnoxious person. And that just becomes the way you are.
Yeah, people seek comfort and they want to give comfort too. So if you can open that door for them, and to your point too, I always say to people, it's the terrorist that practices acts of charitable good. It's the criminal that's a devoted family man. If you use radical empathy, if you let active listening flow, if you're curious about that person, you can find that kernel of humanity to relate to them. What do you have to say about that, Pete?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, being curious, finding something to like about them. In training, it used to be said, me, you, same is what we would say. If you like cricket, I love cricket. Let's go to a cricket match this weekend, even if it's not necessarily true.
Right.
And I think that's more important in the intelligence world necessarily than in the private sector. But I think rapport building and the ability to form genuine personal relationships, whether or not you have ulterior motives, with as broad a group as possible, different personalities, different genders, different cultures is probably the most fundamental skill.
Yeah. Terrific. I'm starting to see some really good questions come through. I can say with certainty we're not going to get to all of them, so I want to get to a few more of mine so that we can answer a couple of these really good questions. And thank you very much for them, and continue to put them in the Q&A. Let's talk a little bit about the role of technology in espionage. We've spent some time on this. There just might be an op-ed in our futures regarding this. We will see. We'll have to keep everybody under wraps with that for just a moment. But, technology has obviously always been a big part of espionage, whether it's the fun but silly character Q in James Bond movies, or you can find real-world details in the International Spy Museum in DC, which is, by the way, really terrific. And I would encourage everybody to visit if you haven't. There's been some incredibly drastic changes, not only in the last few decades, but the last few years. And it seems to be accelerating with the rise of facial recognition technology, the surveillance state. I'd love to get your thoughts as former case officers and individuals focused on technology and national security today. Pete, I'll start with you.
Sure. There was a report that came out about a month ago. It was called The Digital Case Officer. I don't know if you guys have seen it. I thought it was really interesting. It talked about really like new technology is resulting in the end of anonymity.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea, how we were trained, the idea of being able to conduct an operational act when you're clean, when you're dark, perhaps after a 12-hour SDR surveillance detection route on the streets of Moscow.
Yeah.
It's probably a thing of the past. I don't know that to be absolutely accurate, but with the advent of technology, similar to that, the ability to travel in alias, right, which is something that I did at times, with facial recognition technology, with cameras on every corner in trains and buses. I don't know how you do that.
Right.
So
yeah, it's a major challenge now. Guillermo, over to you. I know you've shared some interesting things to me about facial recognition technology in just the last few years.
Oh yeah. And I would just add, when people wonder why, say, the Chinese intelligence services have hacked into databases containing the identities of Americans, the OPM hack, for example.
Yes.
One of the reasons for that is when you have this massive database of people's information that you can correlate, or the hacks of telephone companies for call records, with the technology available now, you have all that in one giant data lake. And then you can pick things out from it. You can identify patterns that were unimaginable before. So to Pete's point, the idea that, the way that I would have traveled, a long time ago with, one passport into one country, another one and another one. And by the time I come out somewhere else, there's no record that could tie me together. That's impossible now. Because the moment, for example, in US airports for sure, but you go to Dubai, for example, or Singapore, you are being scanned more than a dozen times from the moment you get off the plane to the moment you leave the airport. And not just your facial recognition, but they have gait recognition where they're looking at how you walk and other characteristics. Obviously, if they're taking pictures, then you've got iris scans and all that stuff. You'd have to essentially bioengineer a new identity. And obviously that's nearly impossible. And the other factor is all those technical measures that one might employ to disguise have a risk of failure.
Or encouraging them to look at you even more.
Exactly. And so you're going to trust that some tinkering with a data set might allow you to get through an airport. And if it doesn't, you're now behind enemy lines. And in that kind of situation, you're obviously not traveling with a US diplomatic passport. You're about to be in big trouble.
And by data set, you mean a fake mustache, a wig, maybe a stone in your shoe to give you a different gait, as you're saying.
Or trying to manipulate some record somewhere.
Oh, okay.
The problem is that record is only a small piece
Yeah.
of an entire data lake. And so when you do analytics, and you are not, you're not just going to take that one piece. You're going to look at it, and I was like, there's a quote by Marcus Aurelius that I always get wrong, but essentially it's every shadow casts its own darkness, or every darkness, something like that. Essentially implying that a missing element is as much a clue to something you're trying to hide, and so you have to be really careful about how that picture looks to someone who's looking at it very differently than you. And I think the complexities of those manipulations have now reached a level that is, I think, difficult for even a highly resourced intelligence service to do well.
Right. And if you don't carry a cell phone, or if you don't have a LinkedIn profile, that just makes you more notable and more suspicious, right?
That's
It sure
exactly.
does. I mean, when I was at the agency, we weren't supposed to have social media. And I remember when I got out, and I was probably in the private sector a month, and someone said, "You don't have LinkedIn, you look creepy. You need to get one."
Yep.
And so now, if you don't have that, you stand out.
Yeah.
And I think another point with these new technologies is it may mean, right, that the skill sets that intelligence agencies look for are different than when Guillermo and I were coming up. It may be far more important to be able to have, to be skilled at engaging with people online than being really good at figuring out if someone's been following you for the last 6 hours in a foreign city.
Makes a ton of sense. So we continue to get a lot of great questions, and I want to get to them, but I'd be remiss to not talk about cybersecurity, to sit here with two partners at top law firms who focus on cybersecurity and were former case officers. So I want to give you guys the floor just to briefly share with us details on trends in the cybersecurity space. I know, Pete, we were talking about how intense it is right now. Why don't we start with you, just talking about your work a little bit and cybersecurity at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if the question's about what are we most concerned about, I think it would be, nation states potentially pre-positioning capabilities to, leverage against critical infrastructure at a time of their choosing. I would say just more in the day-to-day, though, as we were talking about before, the level of cyber threat activity is higher now than I've seen it in a really long time.
Wow. What do you attribute that to?
It's funny. in some ways, this field is interesting because you can actually sometimes tie it to geopolitical events.
Mhm.
So I always go back to 2021 was very busy. And if you ask cyber practitioners, both on the legal side and the technical side, if you ask the Bureau, if you ask others, they'll probably tell you the first part of 2022 was quieter than usual, and we didn't really know at the time why. And of course, what happened then? It was the Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yeah.
So that sort of made sense. So why it's busy right now, I'm not sure anyone knows, but it really is, and it's a variety of types of attacks, types of threat actors, motivations. A lot of cyber threat activity is financially motivated, but it is complex. I'd say another trend I've seen is organizations increasingly understanding, as compared to say 5 to 10 years ago, that they are a possible, although I would argue a likely victim eventually of a significant cyber incident, and making prudent investments in cybersecurity as a result of that. And I use the word investment very purposefully. Cyber security is industry agnostic. It's agnostic of the size of an organization, its geographical footprint. Anyone's a possible victim. And so I definitely have seen a transformation in that, in just terms of making those investments. And that can be anything from technology, although more in our world, it's uplifting your plans and procedures. It's conducting tabletop exercises with your executives. I've just seen a real trend in that over the past several years.
Thanks for sharing that. Guillermo, over to you.
So my observation is, in the last 15 years, the reason this problem has gotten significantly worse, with a few dips here and there, is the threat, and we call them threat actors, it's the nomenclature of our business, have become very entrepreneurial, very professional. Some of them are businesses that if I could invest in, you'd get some serious returns. They're making a lot of money with fairly low risk of getting caught. They don't have to pay taxes. Most of them are in Russia, not exclusively, but especially the ransomware or the extortion gangs created the equivalent of cloud services for themselves. We call them ransomware as a service, with the same business tools that a startup would have, where they would escrow the funds coming in from the victim to make sure everybody gets their share. Very professional. They don't last as long as businesses because they're criminals and they're falling out, or the FBI does something to them. On the other side are our clients, the victims. And when you look at most companies, even ones that have been hit once, still struggle to imagine what it's like to go through an incident.
Yeah.
After they do, different picture. But it's a very uneven and unequal battlefield in terms of the perception. And so what you end up seeing is not enough investment until there's something serious. And then, frankly, sometimes too much, because they're pouring huge amounts of money and the bucket is overflowing. So I see a big part of my role in this area trying to raise the level of awareness in our clients. And we do these through different things, but one of my favorites is something we call tabletops or war games. And, really working through those, and they can be helpful, but sometimes I bring in a couple of threat intelligence professionals that I work with who spend all their life pretending to be criminals in these places, just to talk about what that's like. And they can understand that some of these criminal groups will invest 20, 30 hours to penetrate a network, put ransomware in, exfiltrate data, and walk away with 5, 10, $15 million.
Wow.
You find me another business where
Exactly.
that investment of time gets you that much money with no tax consequences.
I think the biggest ROI in the area of cybersecurity may be tabletop exercises. I really have seen it, and forcing, and really the importance of doing it at the senior executive level. You know, if your company gets hit with a massive ransomware attack where the decisions are, should we start negotiating with this threat actor that may or may not be associated with a sanctioned entity? Should we pay a ransom? Those are questions that are decisions that are made by the CEO.
Yeah.
With the general counsel, maybe in consultation with the board.
Yeah.
Test your plan at that level.
Yeah.
And force decision makers, force them to make really hard decisions with imperfect information.
Yep.
And information that absolutely is going to change in 6 hours, and then 6 hours after that,
Yeah.
and 6 hours after that.
So it's about business continuity, it's about crisis management, and it's about having a relationship with Goodwin, with K&L Gates, and with a security and intelligence firm like Interfor International to, you know, have the resources at your disposal so that you're not scrambling when your company's hit.
Appreciate the subtle.
Of course.
I'll put it a different way. So I'm sure you've heard the concept of left of boom and right of boom, right? So everything you do before you get blown up, and then everything you have to do after you get blown up. I used to start these tabletops with that idea, and you know, I have a line bar, and then have, you know, everything on the left was green, and I'd say this is cheap, low stress, you know, and everything into the red is this is a mess. Every minute on that red side that you can buy on the green side will pay dividends like you will not imagine. Because when you're in the middle of the crisis, you might be able to spend more money. You might be able to try to add more people, but you cannot give them more time. There's a great Napoleon quote, you know, ask me for anything, but don't ask me for more time because I can't give you more time. So time is always of the essence, and anything I can do before that I don't have to do during, that's worth
I
it.
could not agree more,
Yeah.
and it is often the little things that are overlooked. It's who are we going to call on a Saturday night when we realize that we're under attack, and where is their contact information?
Right.
It's simple as that. And I urge my clients to put my personal cell phone number in theirs, because if it's stored on their system and their system's down, that doesn't do them very good. It's just the little things.
Great point.
Yeah.
Let's bring it back to the world of case officers for a minute. I do have our eye on the finish line here. I'd like us to end just a few minutes before 1 o'clock. So those local time here. So if you have a meeting, you can get to it. But I think this is a really interesting question. Giving your job meant minimizing surprise. What did you learn about fighting your own cognitive biases? And when was the last time you were genuinely surprised? Let's go first, Guillermo.
Genuinely surprised. Probably this morning. I'm surprised a lot. No, it's no,
But the cognitive bias aspect is pretty interesting as a case officer.
so the cognitive bias is, it's a human, it's both a human weakness and a human strength. I mean, you have to understand the reason you have these is they're tools for certain kinds of decision making, right? And recognize the difference when they're being applied. But I think in general, you work through cognitive bias by being very open and asking the open-ended questions, active listening, because cognitive bias is going to creep in when you start thinking about whatever you're going to think about and not listening to the person. And you're going to miss the cue because you're thinking, oh, I think they're talking about this. And that's not what they're talking about. But your brain is already engaged in interpreting the information in light of that. And you go down that path.
That's interesting.
The other thing that is really important is when I'm doing interviews now at a law firm or engaging with clients, I really like to have someone taking notes for me.
Yeah.
And I train them, especially for investigation type interviews, I have just a system where I divide the page into two. One side is what they're saying, and the other side is how they're acting.
Yeah.
And you can have little shorthands, but like I'll have a little squiggle when, They look a little,
They rub the
And
back
that's-
of their neck after you say something.
something like that, right? And that's important because afterwards, when you debrief, I see some things, but my colleague who's focusing on what they're saying will see something else. And that part of it is really important. And I would add, this is one of the huge challenges we have with COVID and post-COVID. We have moved away from so much in person that when you finish one of those interviews now, you don't go out for a drink and talk about it.
You lose so much.
And you lose so much.
So much.
And I would, to all the listeners and participants who may be in our fields, make every effort to reconnect with your people, because that's where you get that added benefit. That's when someone goes, they said that, but I thought they meant something else. You don't get that if you all shut down your Zoom and go and do your thing.
Right.
You go to the next Zoom.
Right.
Exactly.
It's an apprenticeship profession.
Yes.
I have a quick build on that before I pass it over to you that, in terms of note taking, I always point out to people that when there's a hostage situation and the FBI is involved, the hostage negotiator is not taking notes, right? They're building rapport, they're trying to verbally mirror, but they have someone who's taking notes there. So I always encourage people, especially if you're senior, bring a junior member to attend the meeting. They'll learn and take robust notes, and then you debrief afterwards. So I'd love to hear anything on that from you, Pete. But also in terms of cognitive biases, I think you were touching on this. I like to tell people that the old cliche that you can't judge a book by its cover is wrong. You should judge a book by its cover. Be prepared to understand that you're being a little biased, but a lot of times we're right about our assumptions and they can lead us to better places. I wonder if that resonates with you as a case officer.
It does. Although I'm going to just go to the question about being surprised.
Yeah.
And it goes against a little bit of what I said earlier. It's times where I'll have a client that experiences a big incident and they're surprised. And you're on the first call with them and it's almost the deer in the headlights. I can't believe this is happening to me. And maybe it's just because we live in this world and we see it so often. But it is, I definitely would say that's the last time I've been surprised. It's when a client gets attacked and there's this lack of understanding that this is in the headlines every day. This has been going on for years and years and years. The problem, the risks are just getting greater and greater.
Yeah. Well, we're getting towards the finish line here. I want to finish on something kind of bigger picture. This is a time of rapid change in national security with our alliances. I know we've spoken about this and you guys tend to agree that espionage is kind of diplomacy in different form, right? And with all the challenges of technology, there's concern in the intelligence community that the human intelligence might get thrown out because it could be more difficult to practice. What are your thoughts on the future of human intelligence, and what are your thoughts on how these changes and global shifts are impacting U.S. national security? I know that there's a lot to unpack in just a couple minutes, but Pete, I'll give you the floor to kind of wrap up with any thoughts on that area.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with the notion that espionage, has value, can maybe achieve some things that traditional diplomacy can't.
Right.
The problem is it's really, really hard. It is really hard to develop a relationship with a person over a long period of time, eventually let them know who you are and work with, look them in the eye and ask them to commit espionage. That's really hard. And I think as we've been talking about with technology, that's only getting harder. And it traditionally has required a bond, a degree of trust that I just don't know is possible to achieve in the digital world. So I think, I do think that though, there are younger generations that I think are much more open to maybe interacting with strangers online, providing them with personal information to a degree that boggles my mind. And so, in the future, maybe that type of approach will be easier to younger generations. I don't know though.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Guillermo?
I see signs that that's happening. And I'll give you the example. In my cyber practice, we often are dealing with negotiations with the criminals. And there is a degree of rapport that you can establish with them.
For sure.
And there's a moment where that negotiation and that rapport begins to create leverage for the victim, which is very similar to what the FBI would do in their hostage negotiations, obviously. But all of that is done through keyboard. And one of the things I'm not typing on those keyboards, but I'm usually very carefully reading the suggested responses. And a lot of times I'm rewriting them. I'm a lawyer, so, I got to edit stuff. But I'm not writing it to be more lawyerly. It's the opposite. I'm writing it to be more like a Russian speaking English would talk like. In fact, I've been thinking about, could we create a chatbot that would take those things and make them,
Mangle it a little.
exactly. But because you've got to make sure they understand what you're saying, and there's, nuances in that conversation are to be avoided at all costs, because they will come back to bite you. So speaking as plainly as possible is incredibly important. And frankly, you get enough lawyers around the room, nobody can speak plainly, right? Because
Or agree on anything.
So there's that element. I think there is still that rapport. I do think that intelligence, people who are in the business, often, I think, overstate the importance because it's what we do. It has a tremendous role and value in certain discrete areas. It can influence many things tremendously. The value of being able to tell a policymaker, the president, for example, what is actually going through the mind of another leader, an opponent, and not just what they say, but how it's perceived in their circle of trust, is eye-opening. And I've never seen a policymaker, who after being briefed that way goes, oh, that's not important. No, they'll have lots of questions, and in fact, it's often much more, a lot of the people we would brief are very savvy about other people. They're politicians.
Yeah.
They know how to manipulate people. And so when they would get an intercept, an electronic intercept with a conversation, they wouldn't necessarily, sometimes they'd like it, especially if it said nice things about them, but it's not the same as telling them, when they had this meeting and they were talking to their best friend and, or their mistress, and this is what they said. Oh, really? That's gossip. And a lot of what we work with is gossip, in a way, but it's gossip that carries potentially huge implications, right? So if there's somebody out there, near she, who's, obviously an enigma, right? Who can explain whether he really does intend to invade Taiwan in 2020 and 2029. If this is really what he wants to do, or he's not sure, my God, that's worth
very valuable
trillions of dollars, right?
Absolutely. Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I want to thank our audience for being with us today and urge you to keep an eye out for the next intelligence briefing, which will be coming your way in the near future. I want to very much thank Pete Marta and Guillermo Christensen for joining us today. Thanks so much to K&L Gates for hosting us, and have a great day. Thank you so much. Hopefully Don Aviv is on the ground by now.